Today, we're going to be talking about the Korean War, which went on from 1950 until 1953. Sometimes this war is called, unfortunately, the Forgotten War because it's sandwiched between World War II and Vietnam, two much more widely discussed wars. So, we're going to talk very briefly here about what happened in Korea, why nothing changed, and what the legacy is of the war. So, the division of Korea goes back to the end of World War II when we were left with a situation where the Soviet Union had troops in North Korea and the United States had troops in South Korea. And what ends up happening here is North Korea becomes communist in line with the Soviet Union, and the North invades the South, trying to take over the entire Korean peninsula and turn it all communist. So, in response, the United States and other UN countries come to the aid of South Korea, and things don't go well right away at the very start. In the end, we're also going to have China helping the North Koreans fight. The Soviets are going to be supplying the North Koreans as well. You're not going to have much territorial change. In fact, the Korean War is still going on technically right now. They just signed this armistice to end the actual fighting. There's a buffer zone between North and South Korea today. And if you follow the news, you know, lots of tension still. This war is a proxy war in the Cold War. This is the Cold War turning hot. You know, it's a proxy war because we, the United States, do not technically go to war with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union is supplying our allies. So how does this go? So starting off, June 25th, 1950, that is when North Korea invaded South Korea, and this is when the UN comes to their defense. Right away, it's a pretty hastily put together United States Army that starts resupplying the South Korean troops. Now, why does the UN get involved? Well, they looked at this as a small-scale war where they could stop the spread of communism. This is going to put a test to this whole domino theory that's going to dominate throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, where we looked to the rest of the world and we didn't want communism to spread, we being the United States, and we thought we had to stop it. So we're going to have General Douglas MacArthur, a war hero from World War II in the Pacific, put in charge. He's going to be the commander of all of the United Nations forces in South Korea. And the United States itself is going to be providing most of the aid and soldiers in defending the South. So there we see General MacArthur at the top, and General MacArthur, as I said, leading the charge. North Korea invades, and they dominate at the start. The South Korean army and eventually some American soldiers get surrounded in the southeast corner of South Korea, the Pusan Perimeter, and MacArthur's bringing in the troops to resupply the South, and eventually we start fighting back and pushing the North Koreans back. Now here you can see the start of the war with North Koreans advancing into South Korea and eventually getting down to the Pusan Perimeter sector where we get surrounded, as you can see here. So the counterattack happens when the South Koreans and the Americans, the Allies, the UN, they launch this attack on Inchon, which is where the North Koreans were sending in some of their supplies. And that area is very weakly defended. And so this is a success. The North Koreans have to back off. They pull back behind the 38th parallel there in the center of the Korean peninsula. And now the US and UN and South Korean forces begin advancing north. They want to crush the possibility of another invasion of South Korea. So we see this happening here, the advancement out of the Pusan Perimeter, the attack at Inchon, and now the South pushing north into North Korea. Now a problem happens. We get north, we get to the Yalu River, and there's warnings that if we attack too close to that river, the Chinese are going to start sending in soldiers, which they do. And that's a problem just in sheer numbers. So as you can see, thousands and thousands of Chinese troops are entering the conflict. Now things are going bad for the UN forces. And MacArthur, now it's said that he starts considering using the bomb, perhaps multiple atomic bomb strikes. They talk about a full-scale invasion of China. He wants to bring in Chiang Kai-shek's forces from Taiwan as our allies. President Harry Truman hears about this. Not a fan. This starts a much publicized rivalry between President Truman and General MacArthur, which is eventually going to lead to the dismissal of Douglas MacArthur. So here we can see now we got them up to the Yalu River. The Chinese get involved. Now we're in retreat again, and then the war is going to settle out now once more, kind of in the center of the peninsula near the 38th parallel. So as I said, Truman and MacArthur get into this war of words between the two sides, and MacArthur fires back very publicly. He says there is no substitute for victory, directing those words at President Truman. And in response, MacArthur gets fired. And here you can see the newspaper headlines. You can see the newspaper man, Truman sacks MacArthur. You can see. It should be noted that some debate whether MacArthur actually wanted to use that many atomic bombs, but in his own words, in a 1954 interview, MacArthur said that he wanted to drop between 30 and 50 atomic bombs across the neck of Manchuria to create a belt of radioactive cobalt, which would have kept any land invasion out of Korea for at least 60 years. Again, that's in his own words. Well, in the end, we get this stalemate in the center of the Korean peninsula, and that stays there pretty much till 1953 and the end of the war. You get the election of Dwight Eisenhower, the former World War II general, in the 1952 election. He takes office in early 1953, and he wants to end the war, which he does. So we've got the stalemate here again in the center of the Korean peninsula. So the truce, the armistice is made July 1953, and really no land changes hands. It's pretty much exactly where we were before the North invaded the South at the start of the war. So it's 3 years of fighting for not much territorial change, if any at all. Again, as I said at the top of this video, the Korean War considered the forgotten war. And that's so unfortunate because 55,000 Americans died in this war, and their sacrifice should not be forgotten. Another 113,000 Americans were wounded in the war. So why is it forgotten? It's so close, just a few years after World War II. And then on the other side of the Korean War, you're going to have the Vietnam War, which is an incredibly controversial war that gets a lot of publicity, of course, at the time, but also in history textbooks and movies and Hollywood and television shows. And people just don't talk about the Korean War so much. So the forgotten war is created. Now, it's a gruesome war. Just look at the stats. I mean, there was a higher percentage of civilians killed in Korea than Vietnam or World War II as a percentage. 3 million total fatalities from this war, all sides considered. Most of Korea's major cities are destroyed in this war. The South Korean government murdered thousands of people who they thought were communists. On the other side, the North Korean government tortured and starved thousands of prisoners of war. War is never good. War is always ugly. And this was no different. In the end, North Korea becomes one of the most bombed countries in the history of the world. Poverty inflicts that nation moving forward. They stay communist. So one of the nicknames for the Korean War is the Yo-Yo War. And you can see why. I mean, just going through that brief summary of how it all played out, you get the advancement of North Korea at the start, pushing the South down to the Pusan Perimeter. Then there's the counterattack at Inchon, the invasion of the North. So now we're going up north. We get to the Yalu River, get the counterattack with the Chinese getting involved. So then we're down again. And eventually we get that stalemate near the center of the peninsula, near the 38th parallel. Hence the name for the Korean War, the Yo-Yo War. So we see we've had the same family in control of North Korea since that moment in time. Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and now Kim Jong-un in charge of North Korea. And nothing's changed. There was the armistice signed. But technically, these two countries are still at war. We can see we've got the demilitarized zone as it looks today between North and South Korea, which was part of the armistice. So in sum, that's a very, very brief summary of the Korean War. You could go way more in depth in some of the major battles and everything, but this is just meant to be a broad overview of the conflict, why it happened, how the U.S. got involved, and the result. If you like this video, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, turn the bell notifications on. I would greatly appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.